In the spring of 1932, a letter arrived at the diocese of Winchester, Virginia. It was written in careful, trembling handwriting. The envelope bore no return address. Inside, Reverend Thomas Blackwell described something he'd witnessed at the Rutledge estate, something he called an arrangement with the soil itself. He wrote that he would be conducting one final visit to confirm his suspicions. The letter ended mid-sentence. Blackwell never returned to his parish. His body was found 6 weeks later in a ravine 11 miles from the Rutledge property. The coroner ruled it a fall, but the Reverend's boots were clean, and in his coat pocket, they found a list of names, 23 names, all belonging to children the Rutledge family claimed had died of fever between 1898 and 1927. Not one of those children had a marked grave. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Rutledge family came to the Shenandoah Valley sometime around 1863 in the final blood-soaked years of the Civil War. They arrived quietly without fanfare, purchasing over 400 acres of timber and farmland from estate sale no one in the county remembered attending. The deed was signed by a man named Josiah Rutledge, though no census record before that year lists anyone by that name in Virginia, Maryland, or Pennsylvania. It was as if the family had simply appeared, fully formed, with money no one could trace, and a manner that kept neighbors at a respectful, uneasy distance. By 1870, the Rutledges had constructed a large manor house set back from the main road, hidden by a grove of black walnut trees that seemed to grow faster and thicker than anything else in the valley. Local workers helped with the construction, but none of them stayed long. They complained of strange sounds in the foundation, rhythmic, like breathing. They said the cellar had been dug far deeper than any root cellar had a right to be. One carpenter later told his priest that Josiah Rutledge had made him build a second staircase inside the cellar leading down to something he wasn't allowed to see. When the carpenter asked what it was for, Josiah smiled and said, "For keeping promises." The family kept to themselves, attending church only sporadically, and when they did, they sat in the back and left before the fellowship. There were usually 5 or 6 of them at any given time. Josiah, his wife Eleanor, and a rotating number of children whose faces seemed to change slightly from year to year, though no one could say exactly how. People in town began to notice something else. The Rutledge children never aged the way other children did. A boy who looked 8 in 1875 still looked 8 in 1880. And then one Sunday, he was gone, replaced by a younger child. No explanation, no funeral, just a new face in the pew. By the turn of the century, the Rutledge family had become a whispered legend in the valley. Respected, feared, and never questioned. They paid their taxes. They donated to the church, though always anonymously. And every few years, another child would disappear from their household. The family would say it was fever or scarlet fever or diphtheria, and the valley, unwilling to look too closely, would nod and move on. Reverend Thomas Blackwell arrived in the Shenandoah Valley in the autumn of 1929. He was 41 years old, a widower, and by all accounts, a man of unshakable faith and quiet conviction. He had served parishes in Philadelphia and Baltimore, places where poverty and vice were visible and could be fought with sermons and charity. But the diocese sent him to Virginia for a different reason, and they wanted someone who asked questions. The previous Reverend, Father Howard, had served the valley for 32 years without incident. But in his final letter to the bishop, he had written something strange. He said there was a family in his parish that he had failed. He said he had been a coward. He said he prayed God would send someone braver. Blackwell took the assignment seriously. Within his first month, he visited every family in the parish, taking meticulous notes about attendance, baptisms, marriages, and deaths. He was a man who believed that a shepherd should know his flock, and he kept a leather journal where he recorded not just names, but details: who was struggling, who was faithful, who seemed to be carrying a hidden weight. It was in this journal that the name Rutledge first appeared, written in the margin beside a question mark. A parishioner had mentioned them in passing, saying they were good people but kept to themselves. When Blackwell asked how many children they had, the parishioner paused, then said, It's hard to say. They've had a lot of tragedy. Blackwell made his first visit to the Rutledge estate in early December of 1929. He rode out on horseback just after dawn, following a narrow dirt road that wound through the black walnut grove. He later wrote that the trees seemed wrong, somehow too uniform, planted in rows that formed shapes he couldn't quite recognize from the ground. When he reached the house, he was greeted by a man who introduced himself as Samuel Rutledge, Josiah's grandson. Samuel was pale, thin, and spoke in a voice that Blackwell described as too soft, like something practiced. He invited the Reverend inside for tea. The house was immaculate. The floors were polished. The furniture was old but well maintained. And everywhere on the walls, the mantel, the side tables were photographs. Dozens of them, children mostly, all dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces unsmiling, their eyes staring directly at the camera. Blackwell asked about them. Samuel said they were family. When Blackwell asked if any of them still lived nearby, Samuel's expression didn't change. He said, "They're all still here in a way." Then he poured the tea and asked the Reverend if he'd ever heard of a tithe. That wasn't given to God. Blackwell left the Rutledge estate that afternoon, feeling what he described in his journal as a spiritual unease I have never before experienced, not even in the worst wards of Philadelphia. He wrote that Samuel had been polite, even gracious, but that something in the way he spoke suggested he was performing a script he'd rehearsed many times before. The tea had tasted bitter. The house had been too quiet. No creaking floors, no settling wood, as if the building itself were holding its breath. And those photographs. Blackwell couldn't stop thinking about the photographs. He had counted 47 children across the various frames spanning what appeared to be several generations. But when he'd asked Samuel about the family tree, Samuel had simply smiled and said, "We've been blessed with many children, Reverend, though the Lord seems to call them home young." Over the next several weeks, Blackwell began to dig. He visited the county records office in Winchester, requesting birth and death certificates for anyone with the Rutledge surname going back to 1865. What he found disturbed him. There were 23 death certificates for Rutledge children between the years 1898 and 1907. All listed causes like fever, consumption, or respiratory failure. All were signed by the same country doctor, a man named Edgar Winslow, who had himself died in 1928. But here was the problem. Not one of those children had a burial record, no plots purchased, no headstones, no mention in the church registry of funerals or services. Blackwell returned to the parish records and cross-referenced them with his findings. In 70 years, the Rutledge family had never once requested a Christian burial for a child. When he brought this to the attention of the church board, they grew uncomfortable. One elder, a man named Douglas Penfield, told him to let it go. He said the Rutledges were private people, and that some families preferred to bury their dead on their own land. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unusual in the valley. But Blackwell pressed him. He asked if Penfield had ever seen the Rutledge family graves. Penfield looked away and said, "Some things aren't our business, Reverend." But Blackwell made it his business. In January of 1930, he requested a meeting with Samuel Rutledge under the pretense of offering pastoral care. He rode out to the estate again, this time with a list of names copied from the death certificates. When Samuel welcomed him inside, Blackwell didn't accept tea. He stood in the foyer, surrounded by those unsmiling photographs, and asked directly, "Where are these children buried?" Samuel's face remained calm, but his hands, Blackwell noted, began to tremble. He said, "We keep them close, Reverend. We honor them in our own way." Blackwell asked what that meant. Samuel walked to the window, looked out at the dark soil of the fields beyond, and said, "This land has been in our family for generations. It provides for us, and in return we provide for it." Blackwell wrote in his journal that night that he felt he had glimpsed something ancient and unholy, something that wore the skin of a respectable family, but served a purpose that had nothing to do with God. He wrote that Samuel's words, "We provide for it," had chilled him in a way no theological debate or philosophical argument ever had. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't grief expressed in strange language. This was confession. And the next morning, Blackwell did something he had never done in 20 years of ministry. He went to the local library and began researching folklore. What he found in the archives of the Historical Society should have been dismissed as superstition, but it aligned perfectly with what he'd seen. There were references dating back to colonial times, to families who practiced what settlers called land contracts, agreements made not with other men, but with the soil itself. These were said to be remnants of older European beliefs, things brought over by immigrants who remembered a time before Christianity had fully taken root. The idea was simple and grotesque. Certain land was alive, conscious, and hungry. It could be made fertile, impossibly so, but only if it was fed. And what it wanted was not animal blood or grain. It wanted children. It wanted innocence. It wanted the thing that hurt most to give. Blackwell found a pamphlet published in 1793 by a Quaker missionary named Absalom Reed, who had traveled through the Shenandoah Valley trying to convert what he called the families of the old faith. Reed wrote that he had encountered a settlement where the crops grew taller than anywhere else in the Props colony, where the orchards bore fruit in seasons when they shouldn't, and where no blight or frost ever touched the fields. But he also wrote that the families there had no graveyards. When he asked where they buried their dead, they pointed to the fields and said, "They are working still." Reed left the valley within a week. He wrote that he feared not for his life, but for his soul, because part of him had understood the logic. Part of him had seen the abundance and wondered if God would forgive such a bargain. By February of 1930, Blackwell had compiled enough to bring his concerns formally to the Dostoevsky. He sent a letter describing what he had found: the missing graves, the death certificates, the strange words Samuel had used, and the historical references to families like the Rutledges. He asked for guidance. He asked if an investigation could be launched. The Dostoevsky wrote back 5 weeks later. They thanked him for his diligence. They assured him that they took his concerns seriously, but they also reminded him that the church had no authority to investigate private land or compel families to submit to burial customs they had not chosen. They suggested pastoral care. They suggested prayer. They suggested he not pursue this further without evidence of an actual crime. Blackwell read the letter twice, then burned it in his fireplace. He realized then that he was alone in this. In March of 1932, Blackwell began visiting families who had lived in the valley for multiple generations, people whose grandparents might have known the Rutledges when they first arrived. He didn't ask direct questions. He simply listened, and slowly, carefully, a picture began to emerge. An old woman named Catherine Morrow told him that her grandmother had worked as a housemaid for the Rutledges in the 1880s. She said her grandmother never spoke about what she saw there, but that she'd wake up screaming sometimes, calling out names of children. She said her grandmother quit after 3 months and refused to ever go near that property again, even to pass it on the road. When Blackwell asked why, Catherine leaned close and said, "She told my mother once, just once, that the children there weren't treated cruel. They were treated like crops." A retired farmer named Joseph Carn told Blackwell that his father had sold grain to the Rutledges back in 195. He said his father always commented on how the Rutledge fields produced twice what anyone else's did, even in drought years, even when the rest of the valley was failing. He said people used to joke that the Rutledge had a deal with the devil, but it wasn't a joke. Not really. Joseph said his father once saw a child working in the Rutledge fields at dusk, a little girl no older than 7, and that she was singing something in a language he didn't recognize. When his father waved to her, she didn't wave back. She just stared at him until he left. 2 months later, the Rutledges announced the child had died of fever. Then there was Martin Shields, the town clerk, who had access to property tax records going back to the 1800s. He told Blackwell off the record that the Rutledge land had never once decreased in value. Not during the Panic of 1893, not during the agricultural collapse of 1921. The soil was always rated as prime. The yields were always estimated as exceptional. But here was the strange part. No one had ever actually bought produce from the Rutledges. They grew food, vast amounts of it, but it never went to market. Shields said he'd always assumed they were self-sufficient, maybe selling privately. But when Blackwell asked if he'd ever seen a Rutledge eat, Shields went quiet. Then he said, Come to think of it, Reverend, I don't think I have. By late April, Blackwell had begun to understand what he was dealing with. This wasn't a family. It was a system, a multi-generational ritual that sustained itself through sacrifice and silence. He believed the children weren't dying of disease. He believed they were being given to the land deliberately, and that the family's prosperity, their wealth, their health, their unnerving agelessness was the result. He wrote in his journal, "I now believe the Rutledges are not killers in the conventional sense. They are cultivators, and what they cultivate is not wheat or corn. It is continuation. They feed the earth their young, and in return the earth lets them endure. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline." On the 8th of May 1932, Blackwell wrote a letter to the Diocese of Winchester. It was the letter found after his death, the one with no return address, the one that ended mid-sentence. In it, he stated clearly that he intended to confront the Rutledge family one final time. He wrote that he had gathered enough testimony, enough historical context, and enough spiritual conviction to believe that what was happening on that land was not merely immoral, but satanic in nature. He said he would demand access to the family burial sites. He said he would threaten to involve civil authorities if necessary. And he said that if he did not return within 3 days, the diocese should consider his silence a confirmation of his worst fears. He signed the letter, sealed it, and mailed it on the morning of May 9th. That afternoon, he rode out to the Rutledge estate. No one saw him arrive. No one saw him enter the house, but a farm hand named Willis Tompkins, who worked a neighboring property, reported seeing smoke rising from the Rutledge fields that evening, even though it wasn't burning season. He said the smoke was thick and black and smelled sweet, like burning fruit. He said it rose in a single column perfectly straight despite the wind. And he said that just after sunset he heard singing children's voices high and clear coming from somewhere deep in the Rutledge land. He didn't investigate. He went home, locked his doors, and didn't speak of it until after Blackwell's body was found. The Reverend's body was discovered on June 22, 1932 by a pair of hunters in a ravine 11 miles north of the Rutledge property. He was lying on his back, arms folded across his chest as if he'd been arranged. His neck was broken. His clothes were torn, but his boots, as noted in the coroner's report, were completely clean. No mud, no scratches, nowhere consistent with a fall or a struggle. It was as if he'd been carried there. In his coat pocket, they found the list. 23 names written in Blackwell's hand, each one corresponding to a child listed as dead in the county records. And beneath the names, a single sentence underlined twice: "They are still in the soil." The coroner, a man named Herbert Downing, ruled the death accidental. He wrote that Blackwell had likely wandered off the main road, become disoriented, and fallen. The broken neck was consistent with a tumble down the ravine. The clean boots were attributed to the dry weather. No one questioned it. The church held a quiet funeral. The diocese sent a new priest within the month, and the Rutledge family attended the service. They sat in the back as always. Samuel Rutledge placed a single white lily on Blackwell's grave as he left. A parishioner later said that Samuel looked sad but not surprised, as if he had seen this before, as if he knew it would happen again. The Rutledge family remained on their land for another 11 years. They continued to attend church sporadically. They continued to keep to themselves, and the children continued to come and go, their faces changing, their numbers shifting, always explained away by illness or tragedy that no one ever witnessed. The new priest, Father Augustine Collier, was older, quieter, and by all accounts, had been told not to ask questions. He baptized Rutledge children when requested. He accepted their donations, and when another child's death was reported in 1937, he did not ask to see the body. He simply noted it in the register and moved on. But in 1943, something changed. The United States was deep into the Second World War, and the government began surveying private land in the Shenandoah Valley for potential military use. A team of federal surveyors arrived at the Rutledge property in August of that year, accompanied by local officials, to assess the soil quality and topography. They were denied entry. Samuel Rutledge met them at the gate and told them the land was not for sale, not for lease, and not for survey. The officials insisted they had legal authority. Samuel did not argue. He simply said, "If you enter this land without permission, you will not leave it the same." The surveyors entered anyway. They spent for hours mapping the fields, taking soil samples, and documenting the layout of the estate. They noted that the soil was extraordinarily rich, darker, and denser than anything else in the region. They noted that the crops were lush and vibrant despite the late season. And they noted something else, something they included in their report, but could not explain. In the northeast corner of the property, they found a grove of black walnut trees arranged in a perfect spiral. At the center of the spiral was a stone well covered by an iron grate. When they tried to remove the grate, they heard something from below, a sound like breathing or singing. They left the grate in place and marked the location as not suitable for development. 2 of the surveyors fell ill within a week. Both reported the same symptoms: fever, disorientation, and vivid nightmares about children standing in fields watching them. One recovered after a month. The other, a man named Peter Hutchinson, died in his sleep on September 4, 1943. The doctor listed the cause as heart failure, but Hutchinson's widow said he'd been healthy. She said that the night before he died, he woke up screaming that the children wanted him to come back, that they were still waiting in the soil. The military quietly dropped their claim to the Rutledge land. No explanation was ever given. By 1950, the Rutledge family was gone. No sale was recorded. No forwarding address was left. The house simply stood empty one day, as if they had vanished in the night. The land remained untouched for decades, owned by a trust with no listed members. Taxes paid by an account that never ran dry. In 1978, a developer tried to purchase it. His offer was refused by a lawyer who wouldn't say who he represented. In 1991, the county attempted to seize it for back taxes that didn't actually exist. The paperwork disappeared from the courthouse, and in 2006, a group of amateur ghost hunters tried to enter the property at night. They made it as far as the Black Walnut Grove before their equipment failed. They said the trees were humming. They said they saw faces in the bark. They left and never came back. The land is still there. You can find it on old maps if you know where to look. The house is still standing, though no one has lived in it for over 70 years. And sometimes late in the autumn, when the valley goes quiet and the sun sets early, people say you can still hear it. Children singing in a language no one remembers. A sound rising up from the soil itself. The Rutledge family may be gone, but what they fed, what they made the bargain with is still there, still waiting, still being honored. Because some promises once made don't end when the people who made them die. Some promises are kept by the land itself, and the land never forgets what it's owed. Reverend Thomas Blackwell tried to break that cycle. He tried to pull back the veil and show the world what was hidden beneath generations of silence and respectability. And for that, the land took him too. Not as a child, not as part of the bargain, but as a warning. A reminder that some secrets are buried for a reason, and some families are not meant to be investigated. If you found this story disturbing, if it made you wonder what else might be hidden in the valleys and back roads of this country, then leave a comment. Tell us where you're from. Tell us what you think happened to those children. And ask yourself how many families like the Rutledges are still out there, still keeping their promises, still feeding the soil in exchange for something the rest of us will never understand.